Good evening. My name is Ted Landsmark. I am director of the Kitty and Michael Dukakis Center for Urban and Regional Policy at Northeastern. And I'm delighted tonight to welcome you to the open classroom. This semester, we have focused on steps that might be taken after COVID and how we should begin to think about planning ahead. Tonight, it's a special pleasure to be able to bring together individuals who are working on some of the physical planning aspects of what may lie ahead for us. And given the election outcome of the last few weeks, I think that there's now a high level of optimism concerning the infusion into the economy of funds that may lead to some infrastructure investments. A number of people have talked about the fact that infrastructure investments usually mean building roads and bridges, and clearly that needs to be done. At the same time, a number of people are talking about creating what in effect is a resurrection of the kind of New Deal projects that we saw, or our predecessors saw, in the 1930s as a way of dealing with the economic stresses that followed the Depression. And those kinds of investments, often as not, went into buildings and places and into improving infrastructure in ways that enhanced both the way we experience indoor public spaces and external public spaces. And our two presenters this evening are individuals who have studied and worked on and helped to develop and support ways in which communities that are impacted by that kind of investment have come together to help shape the investments and have come together to really change the exteriors and interiors of our environments. I remind our participants that tonight's session is being videoed and preserved and will be available after tonight's presentation. And also we're going to have a period for questions and answers. It's our expectation that you will post any questions that you have in the Q&A box. We will get to as many of those questions as we can. The other thing I would want to say is that tonight's session is a bit of a precursor of what it is that we'll be looking at in the spring semester of the open classroom. That is to say, we will be taking a look at the winners of Rudy Brunner Awards from across the country, and taking a look at who developed the individual projects that were done and how they've worked out over time. This is an opportunity for us to get a sense of what the spring semester will be like. Our first presenter tonight is Anne-Marie Lubenau, who directs the Rudy Brunner Award process. She will explain what that process is, and then she'll talk about some of the characteristics that have emerged from some of those award winners. And so, Anne-Marie, you're on.
Okay, thank you. Let me get my screen. Okay, can everybody see my screen? Okay, well, thank you, Ted, for that wonderful introduction, and really excited to be a part of this series. As he mentioned, I'm the director of the Rudy Brunner Award for Urban Excellence in Cambridge, Massachusetts. and really appreciate having the opportunity to talk about the role of design of the built environment, of architecture and urban design, and responding to the pandemic and imagining a post-pandemic world. When Ted invited me to speak tonight, he encouraged me to use this as an opportunity to address critical urban development issues faced by Boston and other cities, and also to think about how we can draw hope and inspiration from existing placemaking initiatives, both here in Boston and elsewhere. So I'm going to kick this off by just discussing some of the issues, many of which Ted already touched upon, then tell you a little bit about how the Rudy Brunner Award works, and then share examples of two of our winners, one of which is here in Boston and another one in Memphis, which really help to exemplify ways that urban design, development, and architecture can address some of these issues. And as we're all aware, this year's been a year of unprecedented challenges that have brought into stark relief deepening socioeconomic, racial, and political divides in our country. But as sobering as it is, as Ted mentioned, we have an opportunity with a new incoming administration to think differently, to take stock and create a collective vision for our future. And one of the things that's interesting that I came across this recent article in The Atlantic addressed how there's a great history of cities doing this, that at times where there have been disasters, it's actually been an opportunity for cities to not only come back and recover, but to build back better. One example being after a devastating fire in New York City in the early 1800s, the creation of a reservoir and water system that brought water to the city, not only to address the hazard of future fires, but also brought clean drinking water and therefore better public health, which encouraged more development of the city. The idea of calamity forcing people to ask fundamental questions is also echoed in the UN Habitat's recent world report that looked at what's happening across not only the country, but the world. And in this report, the executive director and Undersecretary General reiterates the importance of sustainable urban development. I think this is particularly important when people are questioning questioning the future of urban development and cities. And it goes without saying, as Ted mentioned, that infrastructure is pretty critical. We've known for some time that our country's infrastructure is woefully in need of investment. There had been an early promise by the current administration to make an investment that never materialized, but now there is hope that with the incoming administration, we will see that investment. Interestingly, as Ted mentioned recently in AIA, there's an article talking about the role of architects in thinking about the future of investing, and also this idea of building upon a works progress administration model to engage people in the process, create jobs, and create public amenities while rebuilding our economy. So I think this idea of thinking about investing in urban infrastructure is really very critical. As Ted again mentioned, so often we think of infrastructure as being roads and bridges. I think really being more expansive in the definition is important, and thinking of arts and culture, education, business and manufacturing, food production and access, housing, municipal buildings and services, parks and public spaces, and transit systems. These all are factors that contribute to equity, public health, safety, our ability to address climate change and resilience. It's about creating access to opportunity, as well as creating connectedness, a sense of social cohesion and community, which is vitally important. And I'm actually adopting this idea. This idea was born out of our 2017 Rudy Brunner Award cycle, where our selection committee observed among our 5 winners a commonality of the investment, the role of public leadership and investment in urban infrastructure, be it housing, be it arts and cultural facilities, be it public spaces, and that being very critical to help cities navigate economic, environmental, and social changes. So even prior to COVID, prior to Black Lives Matter, prior to the issues that we've been confronting in 2020, we already knew we were, with all the investment in urban development and interest, we knew that there were a growing number of issues that we needed to consider. So just a little bit of background on the Rudy Brunner Award. The Rudy Brunner Award is a national urban design award that celebrates transformative places that contribute to the economic, environmental, and social vitality of cities. It was created really in response to a similar time in America, perhaps not quite as critical as it is today, but in the 1980s, when American cities were not as vital as they are today. It was created by an architect based in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Brunner, as a way of increasing understanding of the role of built environment in our lives. Every 2 years, we recognize 5 projects across the US with 1 gold medal and 4 silver medals. They include cash prizes of $50,000 and $10,000. We've awarded since 1987, 88 projects or 88 medals to projects across the country. This map will give you an idea of where they're located. Many of them are concentrated in major urban areas, but we also have a number in smaller urban areas across the country. They are quite diverse. They include all sorts of projects of different scales, from a single building to multiple city blocks and acres, and incorporate arts and culture, civic spaces, workforce development, public markets, business incubators, and transit. Each cycle of the Rudy Brunner Award is really about a conversation about urban excellence. Our process is very thoughtful in that it seeks to understand through the application, through selection committee discussions, how projects are made, how they're put together, the idea that it's not just the product of a talented designer, but it really is a team effort that involves a lot of people and has an impact on the community. Our winners are selected by a 6-member selection committee that's multidisciplinary. It's not just designers. We always have a mayor on our selection committee, a mix of people that are experienced in different aspects of urban development, including not just design, but financing as well. The committee discussion is really the heart of what this process is about. Each person brings their own perspective and experience to the process. And the process itself includes site visits, reviewing the applications, and a lot of discussion and research to, again, uncover how these places are made. At the end of the process, once the medalists are selected, we publish a case study about each project, as well as an essay summarizing the discussion, so that from the beginning, the award was intended to be a way of sharing innovative and creative ideas from across the country to inspire people working in urban development across America. And in our most recent cycle, which was 2019, our selection committee gravitated towards projects that changed the narrative, challenging assumptions and changing attitudes and perceptions about people, places, and urban development. Again, they're quite diverse, including Crosstown Concourse, which I'll talk about later on in the presentation. Beyond Walls, a public art and lighting initiative in Lynn, Massachusetts. Buffalo Bayou Park, a major expansion of an existing urban park along Buffalo Bayou that incorporates stormwater management to really be a model of how to create resilient public space. Parasite Skate Park, a do-it-yourself initiative of young skaters that resulted in the first public skate park in the city of New Orleans. And Sulphur Springs Downtown, the revival of a small city center in rural Texas through street improvements. So the Rudy Brunner Award, we have the benefit now that the award is more than 30 years old of being not only on the front lines of emerging urban development, but also having the long view and being able to look back and identify common trends or attributes among winners. And in a nutshell, these include sort of 5 aspects that we find to be dominant or present in many of our winners, in some cases more or less. But the role of leadership and vision, sometimes it's public, sometimes it's private, sometimes it's community driven. Collaborative partnerships, the idea that transformative projects are rarely the product of one single entity. The importance of engaging and empowering people and communities in the process of development and throughout the process of operating the projects, anchoring in place, rooting projects in their own unique time and place, and finally leveraging the power of design. So as I mentioned earlier, I wanted to share the story of two projects, Crosstown Concourse in Memphis and the Bruce Bowling Municipal building here in Boston, which was a 2017 winner. Interestingly, as I thought about these, both were developed through collaborative partnerships. They were designed to be catalysts and community builders, and they engage and empower people. They embrace community history and values, and really attempt to leverage design to increase equity and affect positive change. So I'm going to begin with Crosstown Concourse in Memphis. It's the rehabilitation of an abandoned Sears Roebuck and Company distribution center into a vertical mixed-use village. This village integrates arts venues, commercial nonprofit offices, health and wellness facilities, a high school, restaurants, retail, and 265 apartments housing over 500 residents. The $210 million development was financed in part through commitments from 8 founding partners, all in the arts, education, and healthcare that leased nearly 50% of the building and helped to govern its operations. The project's goals were pretty ambitious, including creating an open, inclusive space designed to dissolve barriers, promoting openness and spontaneity within the building, creating opportunities for people working and living in various parts to interact, recognizing and embracing the historic character of the historic building, establishing a flexible micro city, and also really taking into consideration the characteristics of sort of what makes great urban places and merging the development with the adjoining neighborhood. The building, the complex itself, is listed on the National Register of Historic Places and was constructed by Sears between 1927 and 1967. It was one of 4 regional distribution centers constructed by the company in Boston, Los Angeles, Memphis, and Minneapolis. In 2007, the property was purchased by a local businessman after it was abandoned by Sears. And he was later approached by Todd Richardson, an academic and art history professor at University of Memphis, Christopher Miner, an artist. And they had an idea for reactivating the property using arts as arts and music as a catalyst for community development. They engaged a team of design, development, and communications experts to develop the feasibility. Among other things, one of the things they did was do some research looking at other projects to see what they could learn. And two of the projects they looked at were the Landmark Center in the Fenway and Mass MoCA in Western Mass. Also, Richardson and Miner founded Crosstown Arts, a nonprofit arts organization, and began hosting programming on site to bring people to the site, to engage with it, and also to begin to kind of nurture and cultivate an artistic and creative community in Memphis. They worked with a Memphis-based firm, Looney Ricks Kiss, to explore alternative approaches to renovating and programming the building, and focused on incorporating components that make up vibrant neighborhoods and create a sense of community, such as housing, education, food and entertainment, and healthcare. Sorry, I got a little bit ahead. And then rather than fill the building with traditional anchors, like corporate offices and national retailers, the team reached out to local businesses, local organizations in the community who would be interested in creating an inclusive building, an inclusive community within the building, and 8 of them signed on as anchor tenants. They include a host of nonprofit organizations focused on the arts, healthcare, and education, as well as locally owned businesses. The completed complex is the largest LEED Platinum certified historic adaptive reuse project in the world. And among other design aspects of the project, 3 10-story atria and multiple building entries promote a sense of connectedness. Crosstown Arts is one of the anchor tenants and operates galleries, over 8,000 square feet of galleries and exhibition space, as well as a shared maker space. They host artist talks, and they have a 420-seat theater. One of the other major tenants is Church Health, a local nonprofit that provides comprehensive health care to the working uninsured. They offer an integrated one-stop shop for health and wellness. This includes primary and urgent care, behavioral health and counseling, physical rehab, vision and dental services. In their facilities inside the building include a teaching kitchen operated with Tulane College of Medicine's culinary kitchen program, as well as a 25,000 square foot fitness facility operated with the local YMCA. And then another really interesting component of this building, all along the developers were focused on the importance of education. And a key tenant is Crosstown High, a learner-centered charter school. This project was catalyzed by the XQ Super School project, a call for submissions that offered money to help inspire the redesign and rethinking of public high schools. Overall, the initiative has contributed $130 million to create super schools throughout the country. So Crosstown High draws students for grades 9 through 12 from across the county in which Memphis is located. And they partner with other tenants within the building to create project-based learning for students, whether it's teaching food preparation in the kitchen or arts with arts-based tenants. The building also includes a variety of locally owned businesses that operate restaurants, cafes, and offer services. One of the interesting ones that's new as a result of the project is Global Kitchen, which is a new startup social venture that houses 3 recent immigrants who are food entrepreneurs and cook food based on their native countries. So they serve food from Syria, Sudan, and Venezuela. And mentioned that housing is a part of this project. There are 265 apartments housing 500 residents. 100 of these are rented by the founding tenants. And Crosstown Concourse offers regular programming that engages people from across Memphis in the arts, in education, and brings them together within the building. And among the activities includes on the right is a traditional mid-autumn Vietnamese festival. And in the spaces that the building is really interesting in that it cultivates large events like this, as well as small meetings with independent consultants who work in the building. And the developers estimate that about 3,000 people pass through the building every day. So it really is a testament to the ability to create community that brings people together. And the developers actually cite that success is not breaking ground nor an opening day, but rather looking 10 years ahead to the future when Crosstown is thriving. So it's a really interesting example of a way to bring people together. So now I'm going to shift to Boston and the Bruce Bowling Municipal Building. I hope some of you participating in this have had a chance to visit it. It's a community-oriented mixed-use development integrating a public school headquarters, transit meeting space, and local retail. It is located in Roxbury and is really an example of a preservation of an existing building that is repurposed for new use with the community in mind. And it's named for Bruce Bowling, a Roxbury native who is a public official and business leader, created and implemented legislation and programs that increased economic opportunity, equal housing, and affordable housing in Boston. Like Crosstown Concourse, the project has lofty goals, revitalizing Dudley Square, now known as Nubian Square, consolidating the administrative office for Boston Public Schools, the major tenant, attracting new business development, encouraging collaboration, designing a 21st century municipal building, demonstrating sustainable economic use and efficient use of government funds, and then retaining and integrating an important historic building within the community. The site had long been associated with the Ferdinand Furniture Store, a 5-story building that housed what was once New England's largest department store. By the 1920s, the area was known as Boston's other downtown, and in 1901, an elevated rail line that became known as the Orange Line was constructed that connected the neighborhood with downtown Boston. Not unlike other cities in the US in the 60s and 70s, urban renewal began to take its toll, including clearance of a large part of the neighborhood for what was then the proposed I-95 highway running through downtown Boston. That project, fortunately, did not happen, but as part of the redevelopment or the development of the Southwest Corridor, which happens to be another Rudy Brunner Award winner, the Orange Line was dismantled, which removed that convenient rail access for the residents between downtown. The creation of the bowling building was really driven by the late mayor Thomas Menino, who was elected to his first term in 1993. And in the early 2000s, the city of Boston started doing some planning in the neighborhood that engaged the community in developing a plan or a vision that became the Roxbury Strategic Master Plan. Later, a few years later, the city of Boston released a request for qualifications that became an international design competition for the Ferdinand building site. And from the applicants, the selected team that emerged was presented by Boston-based Sasaki, along with Netherlands-based Lubenau, for what was called Ferdinand Village, the social heart of Roxbury. And it envisioned a building integrated into the neighborhood, informed by time spent with local residents. The completed 6-story building integrates facades of 3 historic buildings, along with new construction and brick. The designers refer to it as Boston brick with a Dutch touch. So it was a way of integrating a traditional building material in Boston, but using it in a contemporary way. And the new development is adjacent to one of the region's busiest transit stops. So the main tenet of the building is Boston Public Schools, which consolidated their administrative offices from 3 different sites into one, bringing 500 people to the center of Roxbury on a daily basis. And the building includes not only state-of-the-art offices, but also meeting space, including a 1st-floor meeting room where school board meetings are held. And the building's located at the geographic center of the city of Boston, which makes it convenient for teachers and residents and parents. Another important element of this project is the Roxbury Innovation Center. And this is actually an outcome of Mayor Martin Walsh and his desire to create opportunities for residents of Boston to benefit from our growing tech industry. And the center provides a Fab Lab workshop and classroom and event space that provides learning opportunities for adult and youth in design and digital fabrication. The ground floor also houses 6 retail spaces that are focused on locally owned businesses, including a cafe, and both mayoral administrations have provided subsidized rents to enable local businesses to compete. And the 1st floor space has become a venue for not only informal one-on-one meetings or small meetings, but also large events and community gatherings. And the top of the building includes a rooftop event space and deck. So the interesting thing about the bowling building is its span, not unlike many developments like this that take time to mayoral administrations, from groundbreaking under Mayor Menino to the completed project under Mayor Martin Walsh. And it's one of many developments, and I think we'll be talking about this, that have been completed or in planning or development in the heart of Roxbury. And as our selection committee observed, this is an interesting example of civic leadership. So this is an example of ways that cities can drive change and can drive a vision that focuses on equity. And I think also just keeping in mind with the city of Boston, the Walsh administration has really taken some important steps in considering equity, including the recent appointment of Dr. Carolyn Crockett as chief of equity, and considering the role of equity through all the different aspects of city government, including planning and design and development. Also, Mayor Walsh and the city of Boston have taken leadership roles in terms of thinking about climate change and sustainable development. So that's something that not all cities in America benefit from, but helps to position Boston as a leader. And just in closing, coming back to this idea of investing in urban infrastructure and thinking about how critical it is to have leadership, both within the community and government, that is focused on making investments in not only, again, roads and bridges, but also the various elements of our communities that make them strong. So that's it.
Well, thank you. That's highly enlightening, and I know that there are a number of questions that are going to come up around that. I remind our participants that if you do have a question, please post it in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we will get to as many of the questions that come in as possible. And we'll save all of the questions and answers until both of the presentations have been done. Let's now move to Phillip Barash. Phillip is an urban planner from Chicago and New York. He is now doing some writing out in the West, as you'll see from his background. And Phillip has worked around the city on a number of projects that involve placemaking, which is a term that has come into great use over the last decade. He'll talk a bit about placemaking, and in particular about a placemaking initiative that was funded by the Boston Foundation within the city to try to bring together a number of community groups to revitalize their communities through placemaking and design initiatives. So Phillip, you're on.
Thank you, Ted. I wonder if I can just pose a really quick question to Anne-Marie, though, because can I skip the line? Anne-Marie, do you have a favorite among the Rudy Brunner medalists?
That's interesting. I'm not sure I necessarily have a favorite, but there's certainly projects that stand out in my mind for different reasons. So I'm going to dodge the specifics of that right now, but I am sure
well
we
done.
will go back to it.
And we will talk about that a bit during the Q&A period, because the awards have ranged from a lighting project in Lynn, for example, to a skate park, to a project of the size and scale of the renovation of the Sears building in Memphis. But we'll talk about that. Phillip?
Fair enough. Yeah, I mean, this really resonates for me too, because the work that I'm going to touch on today in my presentation also ranges dramatically from parks and plazas to the scale of an entire community. But what kind of holds them all together is this aspect of social infrastructure that Anne-Marie also alluded to. They all serve, no matter the scale, no matter the form, a really vital function in this kind of civil cohesion, public health, resiliency of their neighborhood. So hi, thanks again for having me. I'm Phillip Barash. I serve as a fellow at the Boston Foundation, which is this region's community foundation established over 100 years ago with an endowment totaling more than $1.3 billion, and the proceeds of which go to invest in some of the most urgent and pressing issues of our times. So I'll talk a little bit about a plucky placemaking pilot project called the Place Leadership Network. Let me just share my screen. Okay. Can everybody see my screen, more or less? Great. I think Ted was being a little modest when he was describing the origins and the thrust of this project. He was very instrumental as part of a kind of a thinking group, a kitchen cabinet, in informing this work. I may be misquoting you, Ted, but something that's really stuck with me and a lot of the community leaders with whom I work is that, you know, you've quipped before that Boston is a city designed by developers, and if we succeed at the project that I'm supporting through the Boston Foundation, we might see something like a city that's being shaped by communities instead. I'll dig into the origins of the Place Leadership Network. I'll talk a little bit about the design of the initiative and how it's proceeded, and then extract just a few lessons. It's still early to say what exactly has happened, but that's the arc of this presentation. Yes, it's placemaking, a term which I've avoided using for a variety of reasons. It's charged, it's loaded, means different things to different people. But I think with this proviso that it's about equitable placemaking, I've become more comfortable talking about it in those terms. And it's not just an equitable placemaking pilot program. It invests explicitly in the capacity of community. This is an important distinction from an entire generation of placemaking work for the past decade, which tends to be a little bit transactional, meaning that it invests in an intervention, a site, a new public art sculpture, a new program in a park, but not necessarily in the long-term relationship building work of building capacity in a community to take up these kinds of projects, to sustain them over time, and to really realize benefits from it. So in the work that I'll be talking about, the headline is really about investing in capacity, not in projects. A few assumptions that drive this work. The first, very much resonant with what Anne-Marie has talked about in her presentation, is that public places, our shared spaces in the cities, are really key to vibrancy and resiliency. They're not just nice to have. These are not just fun places to gather and eat ice cream or to walk a dog or to have a family reunion. They serve an essential function. They carry social infrastructures, and over through research, through observation, we know that social infrastructures are they make the difference between literally life and death in neighborhoods. They can lead to vastly different public health outcomes, for instance. And yet they are the most at risk in the city development processes when often, instead of being at the center of our discussion about city making, social infrastructures tend to be afterthoughts, the last space that remains after a development is done. And then finally, the third and perhaps most important thing in the design of this work, there's a great quote by Anita Morrison-Matra, who's works for the Roxbury Cultural District, about how once a culture is removed from a place, the place becomes kind of vulnerable to unscrupulous development. And finally, places have to be self-determined, right? It's not up to disciplinary experts like urban planners and people with fancy degrees or people in positions of power and holding resources to determine what happens in communities. Communities are the best at knowing what ought to happen in their places and in their collective futures. And when we were first at the Boston Foundation, working to design an initiative that responds to that, we kept talking about something like radical trust, right? That we have to, as disciplinary experts, as planners, as philanthropists, we have to really trust in the wisdom and the capacity and the lived experience of communities. And it actually turned out to be quite difficult to accomplish, right? That's just not how we're structured to operate, but we made that a guiding value. And finally, you know, philanthropy is a funny thing. I mean, it can invest its resources in any number of intermediaries, meaning, you know, it can invest in large institutions and research centers at universities, in fellowships within city governments. But our thought was that as the city is undergoing rapid change, we ought to be investing as close to the ground as we can. Our marginal money and influence ought not to be going towards, you know, the Dukakis Center. No offense, Ted, but towards the community groups that are doing the daily work of placekeeping and placemaking. And so let's ask ourselves kind of a key question. Well, if we believe in the capacity of the community to shape their shared places, if we think that they ought to be in charge of determining the shape of their neighborhoods, who do we actually write the check to? Who are these agents that we're talking about? And so through a series of almost a year-long series of conversations, co-design sessions with community groups, with institutions, with peer philanthropies, with government, we came up with a notion that there's a kind of a field of urban agents out there that are responsible for the design, planning, and stewardship of their community assets, their social infrastructures, but they don't necessarily think of themselves that way. Kind of weird paradox. We invited applications into the Place Leadership Network. I'll talk about the design of that program in just a moment. From a variety, an entire continuum of organizations that serve
Well, we may have a technical transmission glitch, but let's just wait a moment. There we go. You'll have to unmute.
I'm back.
Good.
All right, great. Sorry about that. Okay, what are you seeing?
The PLN update for program.
Great.
Great.
That's terrific. Okay, back to it. So anyway, so as I was saying, a broad continuum of different urban agents that serve this essential function in their communities. We received 40 applications or so into the initial cohort of the Place Leadership Network. And you can tell that they're very much not like one another. They don't usually share a table. Briefly, of the 40 or so applicants into the Place Leadership Network, some were major organizations with significant budgets, like say, trustees of reservations and other large conservancy groups like that. Some were tiny little garden clubs, but they all saw themselves as being a steward of the social infrastructure of their neighborhood. And I'll just briefly point out that of this pool of applicants, just about half had no previous contact with the Boston Foundation, meaning that they haven't really been recognized necessarily by big institutional powers. They're working kind of as unsung heroes. I just want to lift up the 8 groups from around the Boston region who constitute the inaugural cohort of the Place Leadership Network. Amazing organizations. The Asian Community Development Corporation, which develops affordable housing in Boston's Chinatown, but also does remarkable things with universal design and accessibility in the neighborhood. Bowdoin Geneva Main Streets, a Main Street organization that looks after the small businesses along the commercial corridor, but is also activating some 20 vacant parcels in that community with creative programming. Central Square Business Improvement District in Cambridge, which strengthens the commercial and retail core, but is also doing remarkable cultural placekeeping programs. Charles River Conservancy, maintaining the quality of our Charles River, and also doing inclusive, vibrant programming along the shore. Hyde Square Task Force, a creative youth development organization that is also the holder of Boston's Latin Quarter Cultural District. North Shore CDC, up in El Punto in Salem, which develops housing and is also doing an outdoor art museum and destigmatizing the community through art. Roxbury Cultural District, which stewards the cultural assets of Nubian Square. And the Trustees of Reservations, which in addition to its blockbuster properties around the region, also maintains a network of 50 or so subsistence gardens throughout the Boston area. Really a remarkable group to convene under one roof. Just as an aside, of the 8 teams that are part of the Place Leadership Network, 7 are led by BIPOC leaders, 6 by women, and 3 with New Americans. So really reflects a new Boston. So what is it? What did we do even? Well, these 8 organizations represent a field which hasn't really been recognized before, a field of place leaders, a term that we invented. We thought that, sure, we can invest in the capacity of each one of those organizations to do the important work that they're already doing in their communities, but if we brought them together as a field, if we convened them, put them in the same room, they might share best practices with one another, they might learn from one another. Some are doing amazing work in creative programming, some are really good at finance. So there's an opportunity to learn from one another. And in the process, they might build something like solidarity, which perhaps a little bit optimistically, we think can shift the balance, move the needle from a city being designed by developers to one that's being determined by public interest. For 9 months, with the partnership of the Harvard Graduate School of Design, we brought together these 8 community groups. We visited each other's places for a full day once a month. We ate delicious food. We shared stories. We commiserated. We looked at promising practices. Sometimes the learning took very kind of traditional forms. Here we are at the Bruce Bowling Building, a Rudy Brunner medalist, I believe, talking about cooperative finance. By the way, each meeting was determined by the group that kind of hosted it in the neighborhood. So whatever their interest is, whatever their pain points are, strengths, they inflected the learning that way. Sometimes we went out and did amazing field learning together, as in this example, where we're all gathered in Salem. And then, this happened. Starting in March, our brave experiment went digital, but not the work of the place leaders, of course. We pivoted quickly to support the work of the communities and our cohort. It was remarkable how central their work became to the places of which they were stewards. People had access to fresh, were a bit and provide other social services to the really at the front line. And we, of course, visiting each other's neighborhoods, we've discussed about the social determinants. In all, so in months of peer learning, amazing amount of language, welcomed more than 40 other research holders who brought something to our share. Over $455,000 directly, not necessarily to strengthen the overall. What's it all about in these 9 months? Venture a few quick is that we built sense of mutual solidarity. You're seeing from quickly compiled by just as they were super mobilized, go to what's social.
We're losing some of your audio, and it may be that the satellite that circles overhead is drifting away. What I'm going to encourage you to do is to show the images and then attach as few words as possible, and we'll try to get to what they all mean in our questions and answers.
Can you hear me now?
On and off.
Okay, great. Just go through the remaining. We'll get to questions.
More off than on.
Oh man.
Well, these things happen.
They do.
Why don't you try to summarize some of the key takeaways, and we'll do what we can if there's something that we can do on our end technologically, but if you can show the slides at least, and then just offer a couple of words on each in terms of what some of the learning may be, we can move to the questions and answers which are beginning to come in, and you can fill in some of the gaps through that. How's that?
Are you getting me?
So for those who don't know, Alvaro Lima heads planning and some of the design and research within the Boston Planning and Development Agency, which was one of the collaborators and partners in this process. And the planning team within the city looked at this independently generated process and came away with a sense that it really engaged communities in ways that the city had not seen to this scale before. Phillip, you're back. Try again.
Sure.
There you go.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, cool. Yeah, you know, Ted, it sounds like you were summarizing exactly the kind of the big point of the story, which is that this independent effort, though it was a pilot, it was a prototype, showed something important in our planning and design ecosystem in Boston, which is that there's a deep demand and deep expertise within community for this kind of locally driven planning, design, and governance of our shared spaces. And yet no single venue, no place where we can vet, discuss, advocate, lobby, produce policy, bring resources to the table. The table that we set through the Place Leadership Network turned out to be the only one. And when we encountered elected leaders, when we encountered municipal officials at the BPDA, we kept hearing that same refrain. What if this were a constant resource? How might that shift our development dynamics? And so, as we wrap up this stage of the pilot, that's the big question that we're left with. How do we continue to build that kind of power in the community? And how might a standing resource be part of that story in Boston?
So I'll remind all of the participants that we welcome your questions. Please type them into the Q&A. And I'll start by asking what to me seems to be the obvious question, and that is to say, how is it that a vision that is so community-based came into being in the first place? Why is it that you've been able to focus on projects that are not in fact driven by developers, but in fact seem to have visions that emerge from within the communities themselves? Anne-Marie, Phillip?
I'm happy to start, Anne-Marie.
Yeah.
Just a very quick note on that from my perspective, Ted, is that it's not that we were able to do something special. I think we were just able to shine a light on the work that was already happening in communities, and just from the position of institutional philanthropy, from the position of resources, to give it a little bit more visibility. I think the incredible work of the leaders in communities throughout Boston, not just the 8 that were the first cohort, but 40 plus who are doing this work, is already promising, already innovative, creative work. It just doesn't get enough resources and enough recognition.
Yeah, I would agree. I think I was thinking about, Phillip, one of your comments about the role of the Place Leadership Network being about investing in capacity, not projects. And so often what we are lacking, this goes back to the idea of investing in urban infrastructure beyond the physical investment in physical infrastructure, thinking about how we invest in the social infrastructure and provide access. That often our field of architecture and planning creates barriers, unintended and intended, by the use of language, the use of just practices that may be familiar to those of us who are in the field, but can be very opaque to people outside the field. And I think a lot of, as both of you know, I spent 13 years in Pittsburgh working in the field of community design, and that practice is really grounded in the idea of helping to engage people, involve people in the design of community, in the design of the places where they live. And that is a process that takes time and requires, creating space for people to do that, space and knowledge. And that's not something that most often, certainly government is set up to do.
Tell me.
Well, there's such a.
Yeah, go
Sorry,
on.
Ted. Just a quick note. I mean, there's such a marked difference between government and governance, and at the scale of local places, right? Government can do a lot, but it can only go so far. And so these kind of this fourth layer of governance, the hyper local community scale organizations, provide a lot of the services, as this pandemic has revealed, that are maybe traditionally associated with the role of government.
Tell us a bit about how you go about finding these community voices. It has sometimes been said that on the one side, development is driven by real estate developers and the money that they bring. But on the other side, development is sometimes driven by the most vocal people in the communities, who may or may not always be the most representative people within those communities, particularly as the communities are changing. So how do you go about identifying the community voices in a way where you can feel that they are legitimate and authentic and not just serving their own individual purposes?
I think I'll go back. Philip Prompt asked that question, the provocative question earlier of, do I have a favorite winner among the Rudy Brunner Award medalists? And it's not, as I mentioned, it's not so much a favorite, but there's several medalists that stand out for me. And one is Pike Place Market in Seattle, which was in fact our first medalist. And, for many people, including myself, Pike Place Market is on the surface, it's sort of this festival marketplace. You go there, people throw fish, it's, fun. But the foundation of that project was community driven, a response to a major planned urban redevelopment that would have destroyed the historic marketplace and not only preserved the market itself, but put into place a system of governance that is focused on meeting community needs. So in addition to the market, there is supportive, affordable housing, there's community health center. There are all sorts of services to support the community that was there when it all started. And that really, emerged out of a grassroots effort, in terms of how we identify those. I think it requires an investment of taking time to get to know the community. It means investing in people, particularly if you're thinking about the city, neighborhood planners who are not just reviewing projects, but are in the communities, getting to know people, getting a sense of what the needs are. And that takes resources.
Yeah. I mean, Ted, thanks for that question. It's I should probably lob it right back to you since you served on the selection jury for the Place Leadership Network. But
Well, I did, but I was not the person who, for example, identified who the groups might be who would come forward. And
that's
as you
right.
pointed out,
Yeah, well, we put out
in,
an open application in this case.
some
right,
included
to get
long-established groups, and in some cases there were neighborhood people who had never before been empowered to speak out about what the shape of their neighborhoods were. So how do you inspire those more reticent voices to come forward and to participate in shaping their own communities?
One of the, I think one of the most interesting members of I don't have a favorite either among the participants of the Place Leadership Network, but one really interesting example of the kind of a person that shows up to this planning and development process was a Chinatown resident by the name of Warren Chow, who has no credentials, right? Sort of in a traditional sense at all, other than he's a longtime resident who knows exactly who owns what store and what's behind every back alley and how to navigate that space. And it is that kind of knowledge, that place knowing, that kind of lived experience that brings a completely different perspective to the planning process. It's when we in these positions of institutional authority talk about community, we tend to talk about it as a monolith. There's this community. Sometimes we actually mean really different things. Sometimes we mean a geographical construct. Sometimes it's an affinity group, right? Sometimes it's something else. And it's super complicated, it's super dynamic inside, right? So some of the organizations that claimed to represent a community a generation ago, like CDCs, for instance, are now often being seen by other players in the community as bottlenecks to the public interest. So this is just to say, I think Anne-Marie gave the the best answer to this. It's about really knowing, understanding, investing in the relationships, building trust, and seeing what the dynamic is. We're not in the business of picking winners, right? We're in the business of building trust and capacity.
I think it's also, when I consider some of the strategies for community engagement to lift up voices, it's recognizing that there are different ways to engage. There are going to be the kind of the visible vocal leaders who are always at a meeting speaking up. There are always then the quiet leaders who are kind of the, the fabric that holds the community together, but they're not the ones to be in the spotlight. They're the ones who kind of, know the who's who in the community. And there are some people that might commit their time by, again, being out there in the spotlight, giving testimony in a public hearing, while there are other people who are going to be putting in volunteer hours to knock on doors and make sure people show up at meetings. So again, this takes time. It's not a, put it on social media and everybody's going to know about it. There are different ways to involve people. And I keep thinking, Ted, about when you and I were involved in Boston Creates, the development of the city of Boston's first arts and cultural plan. There was an extensive effort to reach out to different populations. And one of the programs was a bread making workshop titled What Artists Need. And it was a way of engaging people around making bread to have a conversation. I thought that's, again, with the work that Phillip is doing is a great example of how creativity, there are different ways to involve people rather than just putting up a notice or sending out a notice saying there's going to be public meeting. We want your input.
Right. And in our case, we didn't even create, in order to get the open call for applications out and to get people to see themselves as potential place leaders, rather than doing like kind of one-off engagement programming, we went to existing spaces where trust has already been built, to community centers, to local cultural councils, and asked them to let us use their networks, to use their built-in trust.
I know that when we were working on some of the city's anti-violence and education efforts, and we wanted to reach out to people who might not ordinarily have participated in a 5 o'clock or a 6 o'clock or a 7 o'clock evening meeting because they had families and the like, we went into barbershops and beauty salons and into laundromats and simply sat down and talked to people about their interests, so that we knew we were reaching below the level of the normal voices, and we're then hearing from people who were happy to speak but couldn't always show up in those kinds of public forums. One of the questions that came in was how you determine the right balance of self-determination of placemaking between self-determined placemaking from the impacted neighborhood, as opposed to the city's initiatives, where the city will also have a big stake in the outcome of the initiative. And I can say in terms of Boston and other cities, public officials are interested in either generating tax revenues, which don't always reflect what the community would prefer, or in taking care of the people who elected them, because they like to get reelected. So how do you go about balancing between what the community is saying and what public officials may be saying would be the highest and best use in the communities that you've worked in?
Phillip, should I take that? So one approach that I think can make a difference, I guess that's the importance of developing a community vision, or I think getting back to building community capacity and engaging community, helping all of us understand the connection between the policy decisions, the development decisions that are made, and its impact on people, both who are immediately affected within the community as well as more broadly in the city. I like to think that when there's an effort to involve the whole community about, within this discussion, creating a demand and an understanding and accountability for those decisions, because it's not an easy question to answer, because one of the reasons we always have a mayor on the Rudy Brunner Award Selection Committee is because they often best understand the juggling of all these different accounts. They are elected by the people, yet they are faced constantly with decisions or pressure from developers. So it's not an easy answer, but I would offer that there's the role of involving people and engaging people and understanding the planning and development process so that they can be an active part of that in the decision making.
Yeah, I'll chime in on this one for a second. So let's suspend our skepticism for a moment and take at face value the proposition that the role of the city, of the government, is to serve its citizens. Right? That the city is a collection of public servants. And in that scenario, it's up to the residents of the city, right, to the citizens to express their concerns, their demands, to participate in that transaction, to participate in the conversation. I'm going to misquote one of Ted's colleagues now, Dan O'Brien, who is a research professor at Northeastern, and who published a really interesting study on what he calls custodianship, right? The relationship between people who call the 311 non-emergency line for city services and what that says about the provision of city services. And one of the insights, and again, I hope he's not watching this, is something to the effect that people care about a very small geographical slice of the world. When they call in the 311 number, they care, right? They're good stewards of their environment. They see a pothole, a down power line. They take care of, they see themselves as custodians of that infrastructure. But their purview is something like, 17 feet, roughly speaking. And so I think those scales have to be in conversation between people who feel like they are custodians of their own places and the government agencies that are responsible for provision of services. So, I think both of those scales, the citywide kind of big P planning and the small scale community custodianship, need to be in that constant conversation.
I spoke recently with a group of emerging developers, and one of the questions that came up was a very simple one. Why shouldn't developers be the ones who make the determination, given that their work ultimately generates tax dollars that accrue back to the city? Why not just turn cities over to real estate developers?
I mean, that's an interesting proposal. I mean, why do developers want to develop in the city to begin with? Because there's certainly benefits that are offered by the infrastructure, that kind of culture, the culture and history of a community. And they are looking at the bottom line. Developers are looking at the bottom line. Whereas I think one of the aspects that distinguishes a lot of our Rudy Brunner Award winners, and some of them are developed by cities, nonprofit, and private developers, is that there's a social agenda as well, that they are, looking out for, the benefit to the broader community. And in the end, that benefits everybody. One of our medalists is a project in Baltimore that was developed as affordable housing for school teachers in the area. And it was developed as a private development by private developers in Baltimore because they loved their city and they wanted to see their city succeed, but they recognize that this was an opportunity to help invest in education, to help public schools succeed in the city of Baltimore. So I would argue it's sort of thinking about the broader good, and that it is a balance of different perspectives. There's a reason why we have developers on our selection committees, because at the end of the day, the numbers have to work too. So it takes a village to figure this all out.
Sure.
All of these projects also take or appear to take more time to come to fruition than if you simply brought a developer in and said, here's an 8-acre site, do something with this. And time is money. So that there is presumably value that is lost because you're going through these lengthy processes. One of the developers I spoke with recently in Boston went through 400 plus meetings before being able to move forward with the development plan that he had generated, which was going to generate thousands of jobs. So one of the questions that inevitably comes up is, why would one put this kind of time in, particularly as we look forward towards the kind of infrastructure developments that the new administration is going to have to make in order to try to jumpstart the economy? It's a lot easier to make an investment in repairing roads and bridges than to go through a process that might develop a Sears building. So what's the benefit of doing this kind of long, slow work involving so much community input versus simply bringing in traditional planners with expertise, transportation planners and housing planners, and simply saying, here's the money, go ahead and build this thing?
I know you're just being polemical, Ted, but
well, I would like you to talk about how this may or may not help the resilience of the community. And I would also ask that you address some of the downsides of this process. For example, we see beautiful finished projects, but we also know that sometimes these projects run on and generate all kinds of internal community divisiveness. And sometimes the projects don't come to fruition. And you ask yourself at the end of the day, why did we start this? Because we're worse off than when we started. So why not just turn this work over to people with expertise and let them have a go at it?
well, listen, I mean, it's easy to malign real estate developers, right? I think partly because we know that statistically speaking, the easiest things to develop is like suburban sprawl, and you know, that doesn't really end up creating any of the things that we've talked about today, right? Like a sense of social cohesion and resilience. Um, but of course, there's in the complex process of land development, like developers have a role to play. I think, you know, the absurd example with 400 community meetings and then maybe a project not coming to fruition, right? That happens. That can be the case. But my sense, my hunch is that in most communities where a good community process takes place, where people can authentically express like what they want to see in places, some really amazing stuff can happen, as the winners of the Rudy Brunner Award exemplify, and as some work currently happening that's being led by the Place Leadership Network participants it's demonstrating. I'll quickly mention one example, which is that the Roxbury Cultural District is now in the early phases of implementing an obscure kind of a value capture tool called district increment financing, which, without going into great detail, aligns developer incentives with community incentives. So rather than negotiating for community benefit agreements, which sometimes are, you know, are kind of insignificant financially or can skew towards the interest of one fringe group over another, there's actually a system by which you tie the revenues and the tax generated by development in the district to the improvement of the social infrastructure of that district, right? These are not, it's not a zero-sum game, I think is what I'm trying to say here.
And that presumably adds to the resilience of that district. We have tended to think about resilience as something involving just physical infrastructure and flooding and those kinds of catastrophes, but there's another kind of infrastructure and another kind of resilience that we're looking at. Talk a little bit about how your projects address that social infrastructure in a longer term sense.
I think the social actually going back to the idea of sort of why invest time in this, presumably when we build buildings or build these projects, they're going to last for decades or no, more than 100 years. So consider the embodied energy that goes into the physical construct and then the long-term societal value. So, what is the kind of city that we want to be? Do we want to be a city that is just made up of, wealthy people who are based somewhere else and they're, and the city becomes a hollow core of what it is? Ted, to your point about resilience, resiliency means, how adaptable are you to change? How nimble is a place to respond to a pandemic and be able to shift dining outdoors onto city streets? How able are we to respond to changes in technology that affect how we do business? So that, that investment again takes time, but we're talking about investments that are generational, not transactional.
One of the interesting consequences of COVID thus far is that condominium prices in downtowns have declined substantially, as many of the people who bought those fancy developments were in fact not really long-term residents. And the moment COVID hit and the moment they no longer had to show up in their offices, they no longer needed that pied-à-terre in downtown. And so they've abandoned them in months. And we're seeing a decline in real estate prices, and many of the large office buildings that have been developed in downtown, which have generated lots of tax revenues, are now significantly empty because people realize that they don't necessarily need, they may want, but they don't necessarily need to work in a high-priced office space. And so we're seeing significant office vacancies. So that then raises the question of whether we're going to focus primarily on external investment in communities that may bring in tax dollars, or whether we're going to invest in the people and resources who have demonstrated a willingness to stick around through thick and thin. And whether there is a balance that can be achieved in that regard. The related question goes to what happens around ethnicity? What happens around trying to bring into the development process those people and voices that we've heard through Black Lives Matter and other demonstrations that begin to broaden the scope and some of the cultural vision that's being expressed in the projects that you've worked on? What have you seen in terms of success, in terms of diversifying what those voices are?
As I illustrated in one of my slides in the presentation, most of the communities that were represented as part of the Place Leadership Network are communities of color, historically redlined neighborhoods, and those who are still grappling with the aftermath of segregation and disinvestment in the city. I think, we can't really talk about American city planning without talking about race. So much of the contemporary urban landscape is structured by redlining and its aftermath. So much of the extractive practices like gentrification, displacement, development now are very much the legacy of that, right? Of kind of emptying certain neighborhoods of value and then coming in and redeveloping them. So for us, for the kinds of discussions that we had within the Place Leadership Network, for the kinds of work that the community organizations are doing, that legacy and its contemporary impacts are very much top of mind. And I think we should all do more to acknowledge that publicly and grapple with that as we think about the shape of city.
I would ask both of you a closing question that relates to an overlap in your presentations. Both of you made reference to projects that are going on in Nubian Square, which is only a quarter of a mile from the Northeastern campus. And students sometimes have raised the question of how one goes about planning forward with the kinds of wonderful developments that we saw at the bowling building, for example, or the site improvements that we're seeing coming out of the group in Nubian Square. But how do we move forward with those kinds of things without exacerbating issues of gentrification and limiting, ultimately, the opportunities that exist for people who are within that neighborhood? And in that regard, what can you imagine that Northeastern as an institution might do to serve and be beneficial to the people you've worked with in Nubian Square and throughout Roxbury?
Well, one thing, just to touch upon the Northeastern connection, it's interesting. One of the shortcomings often of planning efforts is the tendency to sort of draw boundaries. We're just working in this neighborhood or this neighborhood. And I think particularly for a city like Boston, but this is common in other communities, thinking about what are the connections across communities and thinking about how either development that's happening in one neighborhood may be affecting another one, or as well as opportunities to share and develop resources across communities. And I think that's, that was part of the vision for the development of the Ferdinand site, was recognizing that it's at the geographic heart of the city. It's adjacent to a major transportation hub. So the potential is there, but I think it also gets back to that connection between that the question Chuck Allett asked about sort of how do we balance sort of specific kind of neighborhood, the self-determination of individual communities, but also think about the context of the broader city.
Well, was that a hand, Phillip?
I was, it was actually, I was about to snap some fingers, Anne-Marie. I think that's exactly right. I think we do have to, we have to understand that like neighborhoods are dynamic, that they're not, they're not in amber, that there's an entire regional context for this. I know it's a little bit of avoiding Ted's very good question, but one thing that I found really impressive about what the Asian Community Development Corporation is doing in Chinatown is that rather than just strictly defining their boundaries as Boston Chinatown, knowing that so much of the people whom they serve now live regionally in places like Quincy and etc. They're thinking of themselves as serving a community, not just geographically, but by affinity, in this case, by ethnicity. So I think even though we've talked this whole time about the importance of place and community in this very physical sense, I think we do have to look at that broader dynamic as well.
Well, I think we'll go into a lot of detail around that in the spring semester. Anne-Marie, you were going to make a last comment?
I just wanted to add just how much I appreciate the having the two of us talk tonight, because I think one of the observations from the most recent 2019 Rudy Brunner Award round was questioning who's leading development. That despite on the 5 winners, the intention of creating equitable, inclusive places, the fact that the majority of the projects were led by, developments by white men, and sort of thinking about how do we create, enable, as a colleague of mine said, not only for other people to be at the table, but to set the table. And I think initiatives like the Place Leadership Network are a terrific example of how we begin to build the capacity to allow, everybody to participate in the developing and shaping the future of cities like Boston.
Well, as we're seeing from all kinds of media, there's lots of discussion now ongoing about what kinds of investments will need to be made and will in fact be made by a new administration in Washington in not just physical infrastructure, but in human infrastructure, in social infrastructure, in cultural infrastructure, in the people who make the physical infrastructure viable. And we'll spend a good chunk of the spring semester focusing on those issues in particular around financing and affordable housing and resilience, around the role of culture. And we'll be doing it really in real time as we're seeing investments as they start to be made. So it's been really wonderful to have both of you on tonight to begin this conversation, which we'll pick up in the spring. We're off next week for Thanksgiving, but then we'll be back for the last weeks of the semester, and during which we'll be discussing the role of culture, both large and small, in investing, looking forward, and in some criminal justice discussion. What are the kinds of investments that need to be made as we begin to think about changing the way we work within the context of our criminal justice system, on campus, off campus, and across the country. So I wish everyone a safe and caring Thanksgiving. We've all been encouraged to try to stay put as much as possible. We're in a very difficult and dangerous time vis-a-vis the health issues raised by COVID, and we're not going to see a vaccine that's widely distributed for a while. So I urge everyone to be safe and careful over this coming Thanksgiving. We'll be back in 2 weeks. And again, I thank our speakers and our participants in tonight's conversation. My best to all, and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.